Howdy folks, this is Justro at Metcalf Mills bringing you Storytime Tuesday. I've got you a good one today. It's about somebody that meant the world to me, and I'm glad I can share it with you. I hope you enjoy it. I want to dedicate today's video to Miss Linda watching down in Alabama. We love you, Miss Linda, and we appreciate you.
Thank you, Miss Linda.
Now you can stay tuned into this video because at the end of it I'm going to show you some nice old pictures and explain about them. Folks, today I want to talk to you about my grandpa. And he was the only grandpa I had. It was Daddy's daddy. My other grandpa died before I was born on mother's side, but I want to talk to you about my grandpa, which is Daddy's daddy. His name was Gay Jeffrey Metcalf, and he was born in 1921 at the head of Indian Creek over in Yancey County, in an old house up there that was built by his grandma and grandpa on his mama's side. Jeff and Sis Ball built the house where they lived. And he's born in 1921, and he growed up in a family of 6 boys and 5 girls. There was 13 young'uns total, but 2 of them died. I don't know if maybe one died right when it was born and one lived a while and then died, but great-grandma, she had 13 young'uns and 11 of them lived. But he was raised up there at the head of Indian Creek and growed up in the mountains, and probably rarely ever left Indian Creek when he was growing up. And he told me several stories about growing up, and especially about going to school. And there's a little school on Indian Creek there where they went, little one-room schoolhouse, and they'd walk to school. I think it was from the end of Indian Creek Road up in the head of the holler where they lived was about a mile, so it was down to Indian Creek School. It was about 2 or 3 miles from their house down to the school, because it was about a mile from the head of Indian Creek up the holler to where their house was. So it's a long walk to school and back. And Pa said when they was going to school, they'd take cornbread and milk to eat for dinner. And he said they'd put it in a jar, put cornbread in there and pour some milk in with it, and that's what they'd eat for dinner. And he said they'd put it back there behind the school in the creek to keep it cool. And he said one day it come a big storm and the creek got up and it washed their cornbread and milk away. They didn't have nothing to eat for dinner that day. Had to go without. So probably somewhere way down the line in the Mississippi River or somewhere, there's probably some jars that's got some cornbread and milk in them, or they had some cornbread and milk in them at one time. I thought that was a real interesting story he told me. And the little school there where they just went to 4th grade. That's as high as they went there. And his Pa's daddy made him keep going to school after he finished the 4th grade. Pa said he had to go 4 years in the 4th grade. And, you know, he got tired of going to school over and over, and he just kind of got aggravating and was horseplaying around, and the teacher got on him and put him under the table there. Try to keep him under that table out of trouble and probably from aggravating others and stuff. And he got to carrying that table around on his back in the classroom. They said the teacher got up on the table and sat down on it, and he picked the teacher table all up and was carrying the teacher around the classroom. He said after that 4th year in the 4th grade, he said he told Papa he wasn't going back to school, and he was a big boy by then, and he said Papa never made him go no more. He didn't go no more after that. I guess he started working on jobs and stuff. I know he helped Papa cut timber. And Pa said that he'd cut timber a lot of days for 10 cents an hour. That's pulling a cross-cut saw 10 hours a day for 10 cents an hour. But then 10 cents will buy a whole lot more than it. Now 10 cents ain't hardly worth picking up off the ground. But then it was really something. And he said his daddy, Papa, had worked for 5 cents an hour before. So it's different times then, and I'm thankful that I got to hear about a lot of them from Pa and learn from him. And he said they'd go, or Papa would take, he'd go to Asheville once in a great while and sell stuff to generate some money. And one of the things he'd sell is apples. He'd load his wagon down with apples and haul them to Asheville to sell. And he made hammer handles and axe handles and things like that out of hickory to sell in town. And Pa said a time or two, Papa let him and his brother Roy go with him to Asheville on a trip, go with him and ride the wagon. And the way they had to do it was they'd load that. First of all, they'd soak their wagon wheels in the creek. And that water would make them wagon wheels swill up real tight in them tars. Be good and tight to make that trip to Asheville and back. And they had put them on there, and the way they had to do it, that Pa said they'd leave out before daylight in the morning. And instead of the horses trying to pull that wagon up to the top of the Maney Gap to go down into Buncombe County across Martins Creek, he had a team of oxen. They'd hook the oxen in front of the horses, and his oldest boy, Robert, would lead the oxen up to the top of Maney Gap, and they'd unhook them up there on the gap, and Robert would walk and bring them back down to the house, and Papa'd go on across the back side with the wagon load of apples. And in a day's time, they left before daylight. They'd get out to the camping ground out there around Woodland Hills. That was a day's trip. They didn't even get to Asheville. They just got kind of close to it. They'd get out there at Woodland Hills. There, somewhere there, they had a camping ground for people, and Papa would sleep under his wagon. And the next morning, he'd go on into Asheville and set up there what they call the lot on Lexington Avenue there. It's a parking lot now, but they had a big old place there, and they could set up, our farmers and people coming out of the country set up and sell what they had. And Papa'd pull in there with his wagon, and I don't know, he stayed there till he sold out. I don't know how long it'd take him to sell out, 2 or 3 days or what, but I've never thought much about what he done with his horses or mules. I don't know if he had to board them there somewhere, or they just stayed there with him at the wagon, or what. But Pa said one time him and Roy went to Asheville with Papa, and when they got up there, Papa told them to watch a wagon, and he went off up the street somewhere. And they back in at that time, they had street cars running up and down. I guess there's electric street cars on the road on a track running through Asheville. And Pa said him and Roy got to watching them street cars, and he said them horses turned around and was eating the apples off of the wagon. And that was a big thing. That was their money, selling them apples, a lot of it. And them horses was eating their apples. Pa said they didn't tell Papa nothing about it. He'd have probably wore them out if they'd have told him. But anyway, they'd come back, and when they left Asheville, they'd make it back to, I think over here around the Carter Swain house there close to Big Ivy there, they had a place there where they'd camp that night, and then come on back home, come by the store and get maybe coffee, salt, brown sugar, things like that they needed. And now it took him all day to get to Woodland Hills. Now I can be there in my truck in about 25 minutes, probably, easy. That just shows you how much times have changed. Paul said, I don't know how old he was, but they moved from ahead of Indian Creek. Papa bought Uncle John's place over here on the head of the lower creek over here. And he bought that big, it's a nice big house and a big old barn there. He bought that place and that's where they lived. And Paul said when they was moving, they had a bunch of chickens and they put them chickens on a sled, was pulling it with horses across the mountain, and when they was coming down this side, them chickens all got up at the front of the sled, piled up, and a bunch of them smothered to death. Chickens will smother to death if there's a bunch of them and they get piled up. Daddy used to raise some chickens in a chicken house, and he's told me when it comes a big storm, you better get in there and kind of unpile them, because if they get scared, they'll pile up and smother each other to death. So that's what happened. Them chickens piled up on the front of that sled, and they smothered each other to death. And I don't know how many they was. He said there's a bunch of them, and I think they cooked chicken and canned chicken and just tried to make use out of what they had. And they moved over there, and I don't know how old Paul was when they moved there, but then he met Grandma, and they got married. He said they lived over on Hamburg with an old feller named Dolph Robinson, had a big house over there, and he said him and Grandma lived there with Dolph Robinson and his wife after they got married. And he said one night old Dolph come woke him up and said that something wrong with his wife, and his wife had died. And Paul said he had to run down to the barn in the dark, and he had to find a bridle, and he said he felled around to find that old horse's head, and he put the bridle on it in the dark and took off down the road to go get somebody down there, an old granny woman or somebody, to come and help him take care of that woman that died, Miss Robinson. And after that, I think they lived over on Indian Creek, and Daddy was born up here at the head of the creek in that old house. I've told you that story before. And then they lived over on Indian Creek some in an old house. And then later on, Paul built a house above Papa's place over at Uncle John's up in the Drake Holler. They built a little house up there, and that's where Daddy lived when he was growing up quite a bit. And Daddy said it was a pretty little old place, a little house, and he said Pa had split out palings and paling the yard in, and said it was real pretty. If you don't know what a paling is, it's about a 4 foot long, 3 foot long piece of a tree split out and rived out into thin boards, and the end of them sharpened. And you put that on a fence with that sharp point up at the top, and that's a paling fence. They used to build them around their yards and around their gardens and everything like that years ago to keep animals out. And they sharpen the top end, and the reason they do that is to keep the chickens out. Because a chicken, it won't fly up on the top of a fence where it's sharp like that. They know they ain't got nowhere to lie up there, and they won't do it. And a chicken, if you watch them, they'll fly up on a fence and sit there and look around, and then they'll fly off to where they want to go. They won't just fly across the fence. They can't see where they're going. So anyway, they had a paling fence, and me and Daddy's walked around up there a lot, and he showed me things around there where he lived, and he showed me a little bank there where he said he played when he was a little boy. He had a little car or something, and he'd make roads on that bank and play around there. And he showed me where that spot is and told me all about it. And he had a good life growing up and had a lot of fun, and they made the best out of what they had. He said one time they had been to the head of the creek picking bam buds, and that's buds off of a balm of Gilead tree, and they sell them. They got some kind of medicinal value to them. And they'd been up there picking bam buds to get a little bit of money out of it, and they was taking them over to Ball Creek there's a store over at Ball Creek. I believe a man's name was Glenn Profit, and he bought herbs and things like that, and they was going up Price's Creek, and a highway patrol stopped them there. And he come up there and he said something to Paul about his car, and anyway, he wanted to drive Paul's car, and Paul got out and he drove down through there, and he couldn't get the car stopped because Paul knew how to pump the brakes and get it to stop. And that highway patrol told Paul, he said, "I'm going to give you a ticket for them brakes." And Daddy said, Paul told him, he said, "Well, I'll just have to work it out because I can't pay it." He said, "We've been up at Indian Creek picking bound buds to buy something to eat with." And he kept talking to him, and that old highway patrolman decided not to give him a ticket, so he let him out of the ticket. And I guess I know Paul had several jobs, working at the sawmill and Rochelle Blankenship sawmill out at Woodland Hills, and one big job he had was at the Lewis Memorial Park up in Asheville, up there off of Beaver Dam. He worked for old Robert Lewis up there for years and years. I think Paul said he worked 17 years and buried 1,600 people, I believe is what he told me. And he worked up there a long time. And he's a good worker. Old Lewis liked him. Daddy worked up there some too, helped Paul. And old Lewis made Paul mad one day, and Paul quit him and went over to another cemetery and started working. And Daddy said it wasn't a few days old Robert Lewis come over and begged Paul to get him to come back up there and take care of his cemetery. I think Paul went back. I think it was different after that, though. And Paul, when they lived over up in the Drake Holler, Daddy said they had a ice box up there. And on Fridays, they'd go to Asheville and buy a 100-pound block of ice, and Paul would put it in that ice box, and they'd have a refrigerator all weekend long off of a 100-pound block of ice. And Paul would do different things too. He'd raise hogs, and Daddy said every once in a while he'd take a ham up to Asheville. There's a meat market up there on Lexington called Sam Irv's Meat Market, or Irv's Meat Market. And Daddy said they went in there one day, him and Paul and Grandma, and Paul took a ham in there he had cured. And there's some old feller there. He must have just been like an old, just like an old roustabout or a tramp or something, just hanging around, And Paul took his ham in there and unwrapped it, and it was laying there, and that old man smarted off and said, "That ham needs trimming up." Boy, it made Paul mad, because that was a big thing for Paul to sell one of them hams. That was a big lick for him to make a good little bit of money on that, and he didn't like that old man saying that about it. It made him mad. And Daddy said, Paul told that old man, he said, "If you don't shut your mouth and get out of here, I'm going to trim you up." He's throwing off on Paul's ham, said it needed trimming up. Paul told him he'd trim him up if he didn't get out of there and hush. Daddy said that old man hit the door. He got out of there. He knowed Paul was mad. And back in, you didn't mess with what little bit somebody had. You didn't mess with it, them or it either, because they was dependent on that. That was their living. Times was way different then, boy. I tell you, it's something to think about, all the how things are and how they've changed. And Paul, Daddy talked about him cradling wheat like I done on that video last week or week before last. Paul and his brother Elmer would sow that wheat over at Papa's and raise it and take a cradle and harvest that stuff. And then the thrashers would come and thrash it and then Daddy said Pa, they'd sack it up, and Pa would take it down there and put it up in the barn loft of that old barn. And Daddy said there's big old boxes in there. He said they'd pour them wheat sacks out in them big old wooden boxes, and that's where they kept their wheat, in that barn loft where it's good and dry. He told me about Pa doing that. He said he could remember Pa throwing them big sacks of wheat up in that barn loft. That was that red Clausen like I drove. And Pa always kept horses and mules and worked them. I can remember when I was a boy, he had a big team of red mules, and their name was Pete and Rosie. And boy, he loved them mules. He'd, no matter where they was at, he could whistle, and them mules would break in a run and come to him. He loved them, and they loved him, I guess. I think he gave them a little sugar cube or something along. That probably helped a whole lot. But I think they bought this place where we live in the early 50s. And there's a big farm down the road here for sale. As a matter of fact, it's down there where Permapasture is, Billy and Michelle and William. Where they're at there is a little piece of that property that was for sale at the same time that this was for sale. And they said they was asking for that place down there, which had a lot of more flatter rolling land on it than this place where we live does. Said they was asking $5,500 for that place and $2,500 for this place. And Grandma thought they never would get it paid for, so they bought this place here. I remember Pa saying if I'd have bought that down there, I could have paid for it 10 times. But he didn't. They bought this here, and that's where they lived. And he done good with it. Him and Grandma was a partnership. They worked together and done good. They'd get up probably 5 o'clock in the morning. Pa would go milk, and Grandma would cook breakfast, and then they'd get on with their day. But it was something else. I can remember in the evenings when I was a little bitty boy, I'd take off to Pa and Grandma's, and I'd start up at the barn where Pa was at, and sometimes I'd meet him coming back with a milk bucket. He'd been to milk, and I remember he'd hold that milk bucket up and tilt it up there and let me drink some of that warm milk out of that milk bucket. I thought that was something now. It was something. And I always tried to help Pa all that I could. He's always good to me, and I tried to always be good to him. And he was real kind-hearted. He had a big heart. And Grandma's mother died right when she was born, or right after she was born one. And Grandma had some half-brothers and sisters, and I've heard some of them talk about how good Pa was to them, because Grandma was way older than they was, and Pa was, after they got married, you know, that was his wife's little brothers and sisters, and he was real good to them. They said at Christmas time, he always had them something, and really made it special for them. That's just the way he was, you know. And then times was hard. That was back in the early 40s, and times was different. That was hard. And for him to do that then, that was really something special, because it was hard to do anything much at that time. But he always tried to help people and was good to people, and he's real special. He liked to do stuff with his brothers. They'd get together and do things. Go to the ramp patch and go to the head of Indian Creek and squirrel hunt and all that stuff, and all that kind of fun. And they bought this place here when Daddy was a pretty big boy, and they worked and got it paid for. And Daddy said the old man that Pa bought this from, he was family. He was, you know, like a cousin or some kind of family like that. And he told somebody, he said, Gay won't never pay for that place. I'll get it back. And Pa was working trying to pay for it, and there's some walnut trees down here. And Daddy said they was over there cutting them walnuts for logs to sell. Daddy said that old man come up, stopped over there in the road off from where they was working there, and he hollered at Pa, and he said, "I forbid you to cut any more of them trees." Boy, that made Pa mad. Daddy said he got mad and put that old feller out of here. I can't remember his name, who he was, but Daddy said he left here when Pa got mad. And he fenced this place off, split locust stakes and fenced it, and cleared a lot of it off, and built him a cabin up on the mountain. He liked to go up there and stay, and he'd cut wood. He'd go up there and stay all night and stay all day and cut wood. And I think he kept 3 families in wood, because after he got old, he liked to do that. And after he quit the cemetery, he started him a business mowing yards, and he mowed a lot of yards and worked like that, making money. And after he had a stroke, I remember he had a stroke and wasn't able to really work no more much after that, and he pretty much just worked around the house from then on. Didn't do a whole lot after that, but he liked to eat. He ate a lot. I remember I was around him a whole lot growing up. Every night he'd eat, if he had it, and he had it most of the time, he'd eat cornbread and milk before he went to bed. He loved cornbread and milk. And I helped him a lot after he got to where he wasn't able. I'd get their wood. They used wood in the cook stove in the kitchen, and he wanted his stove wood busted up real fine, little pieces, so it'd make a hot fire, and I'd try to help them get their wood and help him do things like that. Anything he needed around home, or I tried to help him do it. And after he got old, he couldn't see good or something, or he'd back up. He'd pretty much back up till he hit something in his truck and then stop. And I remember watching down there when he'd come in from going somewhere, and he had to, that last little truck he had, he'd have to get a run and go to back up in his garage shed there where he parked it. And a lot of times he'd miss the shed and hit the post and knock it out, and I'd have to go down there and help him get his shed roof up and put that post back up. Ain't no telling how many times I've done that. And boy, he was something else. He liked dogs. He had, about the dogs I remember him having was a little dog named Blackie, just a little dog. And Blackie I found over on Middle Fork in the creek. It'd come a big rain and the creek was up, and old Blackie had got out there on a rock, and he's a holler, and he's just a little old bitty feller. And somehow the creek wasn't up so bad that I couldn't get him. I got him and brought him home, and he got to be Pa's dog, and Pa loved that dog. He'd ride in the truck with him up on the mountain and go all the time, and that dog was a real companion to Pa. He thought the world of him. And then there's another dog Pa had named old Blackie. He was a big Blackie, and he looked like a big lab or something. He's a big old black dog. And I remember when Blackie was born, I don't even remember the dog that had him, but the dog had some pups down there, and it was in the wintertime. It was cold. And I went down there to check on him, and old Blackie got rooted out, and he was laying there about froze to death. I mean, he was getting stiff. And I got that little pup and took it up there at their house, and they had one of them old big tall Siegler oil heaters in there. Had a vent on the bottom that blowed hot air out. I got old Blackie there in front of that vent on the floor, and I just started working with him, and I'd squeeze his little rib cage there and just force the air out of him, and then when I'd turn loose, it'd draw the air back in. And I kept doing that, and a little while I squeezed him, and when the air come out, I could hear him kind of whining a little bit. You know, when I'd mash that air out of him. And I kept working with that dog, and finally got him roused back up. And I mean, he was like he's froze to death. He was getting stiff. It was bad. And I saved old Blackie, and Pa wound up keeping him. And that dog, to be a big dog, lived to be the oldest dog I've ever seen a big dog live to be. I know that dog was at least 18 years old when it died. It outlived Pa, and after he had to leave a house down there, the dog went to live with his sister, Aunt Ivory, up the road here. And then it went, I think, and lived with my nephew till it died. But that was an old dog, old Blackie was. And he was a good dog. And Pa really thought the world of him, too. Pa would make gravy every morning. Gravy and biscuits is what he eat every morning. And whatever gravy he had left over, he'd take it out there and give it to old Blackie. And they both lived to be old, eating gravy and biscuits every morning. Pa was almost 90, and old Blackie was a big dog at 18, older than 18. He was old. I've never heard of a big dog living as long as Blackie did. And I guess the first memories I got of Pa was down there at the old house one night. In the fall of the year, Pa and Grandma and Mother and Daddy, they liked to get Wolf River apples. They'd go to the farmer's market and get Wolf River apples because they made good applesauce. And one night I heard something down there knocking on the kitchen door after dark, and I went and opened it. And Pa, he's bad to try to scare you a little bit. And when we opened the door, he went, wow, or something like that. He'd make a noise like that and try to scare you. And he's coming in, he had a big old box of apples up on his shoulder he brought over, them Wolf River apples to Mother and Daddy to make applesauce out of. I guess that's about one of the first memories I've got. That and drinking that milk out of that bucket. And I remember he farmed with them mules, and I remember he plowed the side of the hill over there. He kept it plowed, and he growed taters up on the side of the hill. And I remember him up there digging them taters. But he worked hard and had a good life, and seemed like he was pretty happy and satisfied. I always tried to help him all I could, and after he got old and couldn't do much, I really tried to do everything I could for him. I remember he had a place on his shin there on the front of his leg that got it was kind of raw, and it got pretty bad looking, and they give him some of that silver dyeing salve to go on it. And I remember going over there every day and dressing his leg with that salve and bandaging it up for him to keep it from getting worse. And I kept doing that, and it got way better. And I remember on his birthday every year, it was on the 15th of May, after I got big enough and was working, I'd buy him a box of backer every year for his birthday. He liked Mammoth Cave twist and big twist. And I'd buy him a box of backer and take it and give it to him. And he loved to celebrate, like I was talking about Christmas. And he loved to, do things and have fun. And at one time, he had an old Santa Claus suit he got somewhere, and he'd dress up like Santa Claus and give presents out and go around. And he was something else. I mean, he was really special. He just had a real kind heart about him to live the life he did. He had a big heart, and that shows in Daddy. I can see that in my own Daddy, and I hope it shows in me. But he was really special, and I'm really thankful for the time I got to spend with him, going hunting and just doing all kinds of things we done together. And I've got him to thank. He gave me that little corn mill that he run when Daddy was a boy over on Indian Creek. He gave me that, and that's the one I restocked when I was 15 and got it to working. So I've got him to thank for that. And we'd talk about stuff. I'd ride with him to go see his brother, and to sit around and listen to them talk was a real treat. Man, I wish I could have recorded some of that. And I can remember him saying, him or Grandma one, I think it was maybe both of them, if you was going to the store or something, a lot of times we'd ask, you didn't need anything, we're going to the store. And if they did, they'd say, yeah, I need whatever it is. and they'd say, "Come here and let me get you a little piece of money to pay for it." They called it a little piece of money. And I can still remember them saying that. And I guess that just come down from back when money was silver, you know, as a piece of silver, or even they had gold coins, a piece of gold, a little piece of money. I guess that's how that saying come down like it did. Let me get you a little piece of money. But that was my grandpa, and he was a good one, I tell you what. He was a good one. Now this is a picture of my grandpa's family. All of his brothers and sisters and Papa and Ma. And that's my grandpa on the far left side, out there on the left-hand end. And this is a picture of my grandpa and his brothers. And his daddy's sitting there with them in the front. My grandpa in this picture is back in the far right. He had him a little suit on. Now this is a little one-room schoolhouse where Pa went to school on Indian Creek. It's gone now. I never did get to see it. It was gone before I knowed anything about it. But this is it. That's the Indian Creek Schoolhouse. And this picture is Grandma and Pa on the day they got married. And this picture is my grandpa holding Daddy when he was a little boy. And that old horse there's name was Zeb. And Pa told me old Zeb, if he got a chance, he'd run away and you'd have to go hunt him. Every chance he got, he'd run away. And this picture is a picture of Pa holding Daddy when he was a baby. And I guess that must be where they lived on Indian Creek. You see that old corn crib there behind him. And this is a picture of Pa and Grandma in front of one of their backer crops. Big old burly backer crop. Which was a main source of income for a lot of the people here in the mountains. And this is a picture of the community going to the ramp patch. And I'll focus in on my great-grandpa here. I don't know what years this was. Must have been in the 20s. But they was going to the ramp patch, the whole community. My great-grandpa was the one right there down and squatted down in the left-hand corner with overalls on. This is another picture that same day of them up at the ramp patch. This old log house up there, you can see that thing. Shingle roof, hewed out logs. I can't remember if they said this is up on the Maney Fields or where it was at, but it was way back up in the mountains. They went to the ramp patch. And then this one, my great-grandpa was squatted down over on the right-hand side, had his arm up on his digging stick or his walking stick one. And in that same picture is my grandpa's brother Robert, right here center screen. Folks, I hope you enjoyed today's video talking about my grandpa. I sure am thankful for him. And if you like this, hit that like button, subscribe if you ain't already. Hit that notifications bell, tell your friends about me. This is Justro at Metcalf Mills. I look forward to seeing you next time.